Phil, let's just go back just a stage. Let's talk about this point about games entrepreneurs. Are they somehow a different breed compared with other sectors? What are their characteristics and what is similar to other areas in which you've encountered?
I think any entrepreneur shares many amazing characteristics that are common to anyone who is a risk taker and has that determination and vision and the tenacity, as we were speaking of earlier, to really follow through. And I'm always enormously respectful and impressed with any entrepreneur who is prepared to put everything on the line. And you hear those success stories where people literally mortgaged everything. They slid all the chips into the table in order to pursue their vision. And I'm always blown away by that level of, I guess, vision, risk, and ambition. But it's not often purely driven by financial gain. It's often driven by, I want to change the world, whatever I'm defining as the world is. I want to change my piece of it, and I'm always inspired by that.
And talking of being inspired, being blown away, perhaps talk about some of the gaming entrepreneurs you've worked with or negotiated with or simply encountered. Who stands out and why for you? And I know there's legions, but maybe one or two.
I think for many different reasons. I'll give you two contrasting examples. One, inside of a large corporation who was an entrepreneur breaking all the rules, and that was Ken Kutaragi, who was the founder of PlayStation inside of Sony, and he was definitely the rebel inside of the machine, helping to transform an industry and also a company from one state to another. And then I think more recently, a gentleman by the name of Ilkka Paananen, who was the CEO or is the CEO and founder of Supercell, which was a company that I invested in 2010. And he was an extraordinarily articulate about his vision for the people inside the company and how he would build a culture. One of the most impressive I've ever come across. And so I think for very different reasons, those would be two that I would pick.
We'll revert to Sony in just a moment, but that latter point about buying into vision and culture, it's perhaps surprising for some entrepreneurs watching today to see you focusing on that rather than on the value. You saw a commercial opportunity and invested and so on. What was it particularly about that vision and culture which appealed to you?
Well, ultimately, any business is people at its core. And if you see in a founder and a founding team a very unique culture where you know that they have an opportunity to create success. Ilkka self-describes himself as the least powerful CEO in the world because he wanted to position himself in service of his teams rather than in leadership of his people. And I thought that was such a clear articulation of the role of a CEO. And in his particular case, Supercell, the name of the company, these small cellular teams who were empowered and given the opportunity to take risks and then therefore to succeed. It was also backed up in his case by some significant experience, some track record, and some underlying technology. So it wasn't just I was investing in a culture, it was actually a series of things. But in his case, the way he articulated his culture was incredibly compelling.
So in your career, you've worked in a highly entrepreneurial, almost a startup way. You talk about the rebel within, inside three of the biggest corporations on the planet, Sony, Microsoft, and Google. Each clearly has the advantage of the deepest pockets, long-term strategies, and the ability to take risks thereby. What are the challenges of an entrepreneurial approach, like there's Ken Kutaragi days at Sony, there's challenges of that approach inside large corporations?
Well, I think it's easy to think of, in the case of PlayStation, Ken being the rebel inside the machine, but he could easily have become the grit inside the cogs as well. It was a very fine line between challenging the status quo. Bear in mind, when PlayStation started in the early 90s, Sony was a leader of analog consumer electronics, televisions, TVs, stereos, car stereos, all kinds of cameras, all kinds of digital equipment as well, but was not really in the content business in games to speak of, and was definitely not in the video game industry. And there were many people inside of Sony, the old guard of board and senior management, who thought that the games industry was a toy business because they saw the games industry through the lens of Nintendo in Japan, which was very much positioned as a younger product. Whereas Ken's vision, and in fact the name of the product, PlayStation, was to combine entertainment with computer workstation technology and then to propel forward the industry. And the rest is history. The way that PlayStation was able to capture hearts and minds of older and more mature users and to level up the entire industry for everybody was a great vision. But he was also surrounded by what I would describe politely as adult supervision. He was given the resources from within Sony to mean that he had all the right product planning, financial resources, and leadership around him in order to allow him to be successful.
And in a structural sense, there's something of a comparison, although they're such dissimilar businesses, with Microsoft. Microsoft had its position, its value, was built on as a business software developer, essentially, at core. Then coming into games, late into the games market, tail end of the last century, 2000, 2001, whatever. And the challenge of being entrepreneurial and in a completely dissimilar sector for Microsoft was, if anything, even more profound than Sony. What did you think when you entered that culture of Microsoft?
Yeah, they're profoundly different cultures, but with very similar ambitions. And I think Microsoft, although when they entered with Xbox a long time before I joined the company, people were surprised at that as a strategic move for them. But it's worth remembering that actually Microsoft Flight Simulator is one of their oldest and most revered franchises, dating back to the 1980s. So they'd been in and around games for a long period of time. But I think, as has been well written about, they perceived the threat to their future business was if a games console product, whether it was from Sony or Nintendo or anybody else, if they became the gatekeeper to the home and the living room, that was an existential threat to Microsoft's ambitions and strategy in the long term. And so I think from their point of view at that time, it was an obvious move for them to combine their expertise in PC and their understanding of graphics and operating systems, but to package it in a consumer product.
So there's a message there more broadly for entrepreneurs, whether inside larger businesses such as Microsoft, to some extent Sony, it's who are you competing with? Sometimes you have at the margin to compete with yourself, because if you're not going to disrupt yourself, someone absolutely will, and technology in particular does that to companies, which makes it.
And I think that in itself, you're absolutely right. That internal versus external disruption lends or leads to tremendous opportunities for entrepreneurs who are early in a journey in a new product area, and a larger, older company will see that and go, well, that's the thing that I need to accelerate my ambitions to transform my own company. And so I think that's a very valid exit route for a startup, is to position themselves as a accelerant or a catalyst of change within a larger, more established and potentially financially stronger organization. And I think that's a very smart way to think about an exit strategy.
And yeah, that comes on to the Burgess Salmon session we'll be having shortly about exit planning. What you're saying is almost a sort of micro-strategic approach, which is to say, what I do might be relevant to much larger players who are not so mobile, flexible, agile to be able to enter sectors as a complete startup. And that, I think, technology specifically provides that opportunity, perhaps.
Correct. And it may start off as a commercial arrangement between the startup and the potential acquiring company that enables both parties to get to know each other and to then prove to each other that they like each other's culture, and then the acquisition becomes almost just an obvious and simple next step along the line.
Talking of obvious and simple, I'm not sure necessarily either would apply from Google's point of view. Google is as an extraordinary company. It's only what 98. It really has not been around that long, but it's such scale. What attracted you to them, and how does the role there differ from what you've had with Sony and Microsoft in terms of that entrepreneurialism?
Yes, I mean, Google is, again, a completely different culture to anything else that I've experienced. And the company is a very entrepreneurial business. It's very much empowering engineers and product leaders to build their vision of the future. It's an extraordinarily well-run company, although it's only 21 and a bit years old, and therefore relatively young compared to the likes of Sony and Microsoft. The financial structure and the organizational design is fantastic. And I was particularly impressed with the way the company dealt with the challenges of moving to work from home and all of the organizational and infrastructure challenges that all of us faced over the last couple of years. So there's many things that it does which are extraordinary that the consumer or the end user doesn't see.
Let's come on to you as, if anything, as an individual, because you're also an investor. You've touched on one aspect, but what do you typically look for? How far do you value prior track record, quality of management team, projections, strategy?
I think of the things you just listed, bearing in mind that I am historically an early stage investor, so I'm normally trying to help get from 0 to 1 or 0 to 0.1. And therefore, the one thing that I will put least amount of importance on is projections, because all I know is that they're wrong. And I know that track record, culture, people, product, process, what you are going to build, how you are going to build it, those are more important than necessarily we're going to capture X% of this market over, Y months or years.
I think sorry, could I pause you at that moment? So in other words, the implicit advice to those looking to perhaps raise financing in early stage is not to focus on the numbers, the outcome, the economic benefit. It's the vision. Is that essentially the point?
I think you have to demonstrate an understanding of the market you are entering, the cost of whatever the key dynamics are. If in a consumer business, the number one cost will likely be customer acquisition, and how are you going to acquire customers, I think, is an important story to tell. Any successful pitch to an investor or a VC is a compelling story backed up by data. And too many times the data overwhelms the story. And I think it's important to get the balance right. Yes, of course, you need projections, but you don't need to have 50 pages of projections, because we all know that they're going to be wrong. But what you do need to have a clear understanding of is, this is how much cash I will have, and this is how long that cash is going to last me. And that I think that the cash flow aspect of a pre-revenue startup is more important than anything else. And then for a B2B or not necessarily consumer focused, getting to first revenue, getting to first paying customer. Because, and this is a great quote from Jim Barksdale, who was the founding CEO of Netscape back in the day. He used to do an induction talk to the hundreds of people that they were hiring every month and welcoming them to the company. And he would ask a simple question: what is the purpose of a company? And normally somebody would put their hand up and say profit. And he would go, no, that's like saying the purpose of a human is oxygen. That is not the purpose. The purpose of a company is very simple. It is to create and keep a customer. And I was always very inspired by that, because actually, if you break that down and go, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And if I focus just on those two things, creating a new customer and keeping the ones that I have, then by definition, my business will grow.
It's really interesting when you're talking, obviously, in a tech context. My mind's going forward to the interview we have with Levi Roots coming up, where your point about the story is what matters in early stage more than the data or the projections. That's absolutely the case in his case, because his projections weren't right, but the story was so compelling. Talk about some of the pitches you've received. You've been, through your career, you've been on the receiving end of some countless hundreds, probably thousands, if you allow all the games pitches you've had. Top advice for entrepreneurs watching, smart ways to pitch, but also how not to.
I think having in your mind, in your back pocket, and in your laptop a 5-second, 5-minute, and 50-minute version of your story is important, so that you know when you walk into that situation that you are giving the right version of the pitch for the audience, and read the room, understand what it is that the audience is interested in. And I think having that literally 5-second and 5-minute version of what you are about and what your vision is a significant part of the challenge. I've seen the best and the worst pitches of all time, so we could talk about this for days. I mean, I've had game developers sit in front of me in a very small room, apologizing for the fact that their game was still in development, and I'm like, of course, that's fine. I'm very used to seeing early stage product. There's no problem with that. And then proceeding to explain that because the music and sound effects weren't yet in the game, that they were going to sing to me while the presentation was ongoing. So that you can imagine that was one of the more uncomfortable moments of game reviews. I've seen people come prepared with the wrong technology and spending half an hour on their knees under the desk trying to plug things in and get it working with TVs and what have you. And so I think one piece of advice and by the way, I've made this mistake myself many times, is if you are going into a new office, a place that's not yours, where you don't control the environment, make sure that you get in there an hour or a day before, and make sure your technology works and plugs in, and that the internet works and the screen works and all those kind of things, because it will make you less stressed and it will make your audience less stressed as well. So I think that's an important piece of advice. And practice.
Yeah. I mean, Phil, technology never fails at live events, does it? So
no, it's always worked flawlessly. It's always the way.
Always, and as a result, I suspect that we're all reasonably forgiving when that sort of thing happens. But it does happen from time to time. Let's step back and talk about entrepreneurs as a breed or a tribe, perhaps. They quite often tend to be crazy right up to the point of success, and in which case they become geniuses. Elon Musk is one, Steve Jobs another, both serial successes. But how do entrepreneurs identify what is a world changer from what is simply not possible, particularly by their characteristics, if they're not the best at taking advice?
I think that's one of the hardest things, because the entrepreneurs that you just listed and many thousands of others were the 1% when the 99% kept telling them they were wrong. And eventually they were proven to be right. And I think that this goes back to tenacity and vision. You definitely need to have a plan and stick to that plan until the odds are stacked against you, or the competitor does something that overtakes you, and so having that market awareness, I think, is so important to understand everything about the sector that you're in. Who are the players? Who are your competitors? Who are your leaders and followers? Because there will, in tech, there's always somebody doing something similar to what you are doing, and you've got to make sure you have a sustainable point of difference and a sustainably differentiated product, and be prepared to pivot, because it is very, very rare these days that the thing you initially set off to do becomes the thing that was successful at the end of the journey. Every entrepreneur will tell you a story about a pivot or a change or a significant left or right turn that they had to take. Supercell, perfect case in point. Their first product was a Facebook game. Nobody remembers it because it was not massively successful. But their underlying technology was evolved to a point of maturity where it was relatively cheap for them to then repurpose to, in their case, the iOS and iPad. And their next game was Clash of Clans, and that's become a multi-billion-dollar franchise. So I think building not only the organizational resiliency, but the technological resiliency underneath that allows you to pivot without having to rip up the business plan completely is another important step.
Yeah, it's almost as though pivoting is a form of recognizing that some of the best strategies are best done as post-rationalized because the path forks and a better direction emerges. We're coming to the end of the session, Phil, and thank you for your time. I just want to ask a couple of last points. One, who has most inspired you of people you've been around during your career?
Oh, it's an impossibly difficult question to answer because I have been very fortunate over nearly 40 years to meet some of the most incredible business and creative and technical people. If I mention one, it means I'm leaving somebody else out. So it's an almost impossible question to answer. I tell you one person who I did really enjoy meeting, and you mentioned him earlier, and this is a bit of a name drop, but I had a delightful couple of hours with Steve Jobs once, and I thought he was challenging, but I could see his single-minded vision through that conversation. It was not an easy conversation at all, but it definitely resonated, and I could see why he had achieved everything that he had achieved.
Yeah, when I said at the beginning you had a box seat at history, I didn't know about the Steve Jobs couple-hour session. Last point, you've covered a lot of ground, a lot of very smart insights and good advice. But any further advice or any closing advice for a budding entrepreneur watching this? Where should they most focus?
Be crystal clear on what you are building and for whom, and make sure that everybody in your team, whether you have 5 people or 500 people, knows exactly that same vision. And I use the analogy of dropping a pebble into a pool or into a pond. If you are right next to where that pebble drops, you will see the splash and you will understand the impact of that pebble. But if you are at the far edge of that pond, you'll only just see the smallest of ripples and you won't see the significance of it. So I think making sure that every member of your team, however big you are, and particularly these days with a distributed nature to most of our teams, where we're not all in the same office all at the same time, over communicate, make sure that every single member of your team understands and basically that every member of your team can do the version of your 5-second, 5-minute and 50-minute pitch, because that way you will be on this shared enterprise together.
Brilliant, Phil. So Phil Harrison, our time is up at this stage, I'm afraid. Games industry legend. It's been great to discuss entrepreneurialism with you in the context of the extraordinary entrepreneurs you've known, met, invested in, been inspired by, worked for, and of course your own highly entrepreneurial career. Thank you very much for this EntreConf interview. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Greg. Take care.
Cheers, and you.